Welcome to Beyond Belief, Tales of Religious Exodus, where we delve into the personal journeys of people who've left fundamentalist religions. In this series, we explore their experiences within religion, their journey out, and how they found meaning and healing on the other side.
Okay, Jason, thank you so much for joining. And I'll say that I think you're one of the first people who found me completely independent of like me reaching out or knowing somebody. Do you remember how you actually found the podcast?
I believe it was on Reddit.
Cool, that
Yeah,
makes sense. Yeah, I posted on Reddit, so you saw the Reddit post.
yeah,
Here you are. Okay, very cool. And so you grew up Orthodox Jewish, according to my notes, right?
correct.
Can you tell me a bit more about what that type of upbringing was?
Yeah, there's many denominations to in Orthodox Judaism. What the way I would classify myself would be as Yeshivish modern. I don't know if that means anything to your viewers or not.
Yeah, it's probably best to elaborate
Yeah.
further.
So
Even to me, I grew up in Israel,
okay,
Orthodox Jewish,
okay,
so some of the nuances of like, I think it's always fascinating what like each denomination decides is okay and not, right? And a lot of times, it's interesting. It pertains to like music and movies,
right,
and
right,
just like
right.
culture is how it manifests.
Yeah, I like to put Orthodox Judaism on a spectrum from very liberal all the way to the left, and the further right you go, the more conservative it becomes. So essentially, yeshivish refers to people who consider themselves kind of Haredi. They wear kind of a black hat, but they're not considered Hasidish.
Hmm. Yeah.
Hasidim typically are more conservative, even though it's not exactly like a flat line. It's more like kind of like a 3D model because Hasidim also is
Hmm.
kind of like also culturally different. The yeshivish generally refers to people who are not Hasidish. They don't usually speak Yiddish, and they can be just as conservative as Hasidim, but again, it's a different culture. So if you're saying you're yeshivish modern, it means you're kind of Haredi, but a little bit more liberal. So, for
For sure.
example, I grew up with a TV in the house, watched movies,
Hmm.
etc.
It was a TV, but just for movies and not
No, it
for
was a
like
TV.
just
I mean,
broadcast.
it wasn't. It's there's many different. There's no like official doctrine within yeshivish modern, right? It's kind of like a loosely defined group, I guess, and
Right.
it could vary. Depends on which synagogue you go to, who your rabbi is, what yeshiva you go to, what your parents are like, et cetera, et cetera. So,
Right.
just as an example, we had a TV at home. We watched movies. We used to go to the ball game. But, we would pray 3 times a day. I would wear a hat to yeshiva. Of course, school is segregated. And we keep the Torah. And yeah, that's about it.
Right. Compared to your classmates, did you have classmates who were more religious than you? How was that perceived, your modernness?
Yeah, I think that pretty much our schools are pretty much yeshivish modern kind of. I think most people have a TV. So, there's, I think if you would like to kind of define it by geography, if you look, let's say, at Brooklyn, in Brooklyn, there's several Orthodox neighborhoods. You get places like Borough Park, which are typically more Hasidish. You've got Williamsburg, also Hasidish. And then you have places like Flatbush. That's where I grew up. And they're not Hasidish, but they also tend to be a little bit more liberal. So, movies are kind of acceptable. Going to a movie theater, maybe not, but having a TV at home is, more acceptable. So it's kind of more open to the world. Again, it's a slightly different culture. If you
For
if you
sure.
would compare it to yourself who grew up in Israel, I mean, also in Israel, there's different kinds of levels of religious observance. So, if you have a standard Haredi, having TV is absolute uh, unacceptable. But I'm sure you have a few people here and there who do have a TV.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And so I'm curious for like how far back does this go? Was that your parents' journey into that? That's where they find themselves. I'm curious about the context of where you found yourself.
Well, my parents are an odd mix. My mom grew up more liberal. My father grew up more conservative. So there was always this little bit of this kind of tension in the home. Um, and so somehow we just kind of fell into that category.
That was the equilibrium, right?
Yeah.
Can I ask how many siblings you had?
I have 7 siblings.
7 siblings. So they definitely were not liberal in the amount of children
Right. I mean,
they had.
even, if you look at places like Flatbush, having 7 or 8 children is, kind of acceptable. So, yeah, it's kind of standard for thing to have lots of children.
Right. No, oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, I tell people I'm the eldest of 9, and I reassure people that that is actually middle of the
Middle
road
of the road. Exactly.
for,
Exactly.
yeah, or for where it could be. The more liberal have 5 or 6.
Right. Right.
We were like 9, and then when you get really religious, you're doing like the 12 and
Right.
14 thing.
And of course, these things are not exactly defined, right? No one is telling you how many kids to have. It's just that, people who are more modern tend to follow a slightly more modern lifestyle. These aren't necessarily defined.
Yeah. Yeah, there's no doctrine, but there's like a cultural spectrum in which you fall.
Exactly.
It's like points on a scale, right? It's you get a scatter plot. So, what was all this like for you? Where were you in the birth order? Actually,
I was third to last. Third to last.
third to last in the birth order. And what was that like for you in general, being raised in this modern yeshivish environment?
It was it was chaotic. Having a family with 8 children is going to be chaotic no matter what circle you're from.
Hmm.
And my parents are loving, caring people, but again, growing up in a large family can be difficult. But there's also, some positives to growing up in a large family. You're always surrounded with other people. It's never dull. It's always interesting.
Yeah, that's one thing. It is never dull. And what was your relationship with religion at that time? Growing up, going to religious schools,
Yeah, I was
religious
always I
practices.
was always very pious. I was always a good kid. I was always very, very quiet, very serious, and sincere in my religious beliefs.
Okay, interesting. So that's always the fascinating part. I noticed that as a bit of a trend. So if you're with your pious beginnings, do you want to fast forward to when things started to not work out for you?
Yeah, I would say that it's not a question of not working out. It's really a question of, I mean, people generally live religion can leave for several reasons. One reason would be that they're not satisfied. A second reason would be that they just don't find meaning in it, or they start asking questions. And for me, that was more the path that I took. I started asking questions. I started finding inconsistencies. Also, generally, I was not satisfied. I never really quite fit in, or I never felt like I fit in. And I couldn't really find myself a group that I fit in with. And so I guess asking questions, it's hard for me to say exactly what came first, but I didn't fit in. And I'm also a very curious person. So I started asking questions. Couple that together with the fact that I'm kind of exposed a little bit to the world because of my kind of yeshivish modern background. So you start exploring things, you start finding out things about the world, and you start finding inconsistencies. And that was my path. Yeah, this started around age 20, I would say maybe 18, 19, 20. And I remember I'm in yeshiva, and when you're in yeshiva, life can be very dull because this is after high school, right? High school was great. And yeah, I had English education. English education was excellent. And I never really paid attention in the Hebrew class. It just, for some reason, I couldn't pay attention. But secular studies were great. But then after high school, you're in yeshiva you complete high school, and then you're sitting in Beis Medrash, which is yeshiva, just Judaic studies. And you're doing so all day from, 9 o'clock in the morning till 9 o'clock at night. And if you're not satisfied with that, if that doesn't speak to you, your mind starts wandering. Your mind starts looking for meaning, for entertainment. And I remember
Mhm.
looking in our library to try to find to try to find some books. The yeshivas typically have a library, or Tzaras Farm, it's called in Hebrew, a library. And you go there, you start looking around, you start digging, you start trying to explore. And I would look at these books, these Sfarim, and I just couldn't find anything substantive in there. And I'll be going through different time periods. And I would look through the Kohanim, Is it okay if I use the Hebrew names, or is it?
Yeah, especially the broad ones. I will always respect the way I think of it is like everybody has the amorphousness of it is part of what mm, highlights kind of one of the points of this podcast, right? Where, you grew up in a world where the words that you were surrounded by are literally nonsensical to the general public. And that's kind of part of the point that this whole thing's trying to make is that the person walking right next to you in the street, he's actually like, he lives on another planet, right? And so, there's a bit of that. If you want to say it in Hebrew and then clarify in English, but it's all fine.
Sure. Yeah, the problem is you're in yeshiva, you're studying all day and entire day, and there's nothing else in your life really. You get to yeshiva in the morning, you leave at night, and then you go home, you go to sleep, and again and again and again. And if you're not satisfied with that, if you're not able to find any meaning in that, then your mind's going to start wandering, right? We're not, yeshiva is kind of like being in a monastery to a certain extent. It's very, very austere. It's very black and white. It's it's not very, and it's not an enthralling experience, right? So if you
Right.
don't enjoy studying Talmud all day, and by the way, studying Talmud could be a really enriching experience, but for most people, I would say, not if you're doing it every single day, 12 hours a day, right? Most people are not going to be able to sit in a monastery and meditate. Meditation is great. I think studying the Talmud is a kind of meditation, but you could only tolerate it for so much, right? If you do it day in, day out, it eventually becomes very strenuous and very
Yeah.
burdensome. You start looking for other outlets.
Yeah. Exactly. So you were saying the story, right? You were looking in the library, you were looking at books, Jewish books should be noted from different time periods, and none of them was really catching for you.
Yeah, and what would happen was I would start with recent works. They're called achronim, recent works, late works. These are rabbis, 18th, 19th century. And I would look into that, and I wouldn't find any meaning. Then I'll go back a little bit more. Going back a little bit more, the books become more cryptic. I didn't really understand them. I didn't know what they're talking about. And eventually I would always say, you got to go back to the source. What's the source? The source is the Tanakh, the Torah, the Bible, right?
Yeah.
Because that's where everything emanates from. Everything emanates from the Bible. So you go back to the source. And every time I would go back to the source, I would feel even less satisfied because the Torah is not particularly well written, I found. And especially if you're fluent in Hebrew, I'm fluent in Hebrew. And so you go back to the Tanakh, and you can't help but compare it to modern Hebrew. And modern Hebrew is so much more sophisticated, much more advanced. And the Hebrew of the Tanakh is kind of primitive. Obviously, now looking back, it makes sense because it's a book written 2,500 years ago. That's what they knew, that's what they had. But from an Orthodox perspective, the Tanakh is supposed to be the Word of God. It's supposed to be the ultimate compilation. They can't have any flaws. But looking back, I was looking at this book and I found it to be, a primitive book. And that's exactly what it is. And so it kind of creates this conflict. How can the book that's the most sophisticated, the Word of God, a perfect work, sound primitive? That's when my questions really started growing.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you described that really well, right? I recently heard an amazing joke referring to the Bible as the goat herder's guide to the galaxy.
There we go.
And I think that really kind of captures it. I'm curious, your Hebrew fluency, without going into too much detail, was it from one of your parents?
Yes, correct.
Okay. Yeah, it's funny because I grew up in the inverse. When I was raised American in Israel, and my Hebrew was not particularly great because we spoke English at home. And then what happened was that most of my Hebrew came through studying, and I didn't read any books in English, in Hebrew, only in English. And so my Hebrew is kind of stuck in this like semi-biblical kind of thing.
Interesting.
A lot of the modern English words, and this is even though I grew up in Israel, a lot of the modern English words, they've got all sorts of like, words that I don't know, the word that jumps to my mind right now is gachama, whim. And it's a sophisticated word,
Right.
and it definitely does not, as far as I know, exist in ancient Hebrew or in the
No,
Bible. And
definitely
I
not.
learned it as an adult, and I don't have it well enough to ever use it in a conversation. I just
Right.
know
Of
of it.
course. Of
And
course.
that's the inverse of it. So it's almost like a case in point to what you're saying, that because I was raised on biblical Hebrew, I know not to go to the store and ask for a pas lechem,
Yes, exactly.
but
Exactly.
that's the joke of the Americans who only know that stuff. So I'm somewhere in the middle. But I grew up around unsophisticated English speaking, Hebrew speaking classmates. Didn't like talking to them. Didn't like reading Hebrew books, which in my mind were always either translations of English
Right.
or just inferior Hebrew authors,
Yes.
like Orthodox Jewish authors, which were
Yeah.
terrible.
Yeah.
And so I skipped that, and I ended up not having a great Hebrew vocabulary.
Right.
And did that not me?
Makes sense. Yeah.
um, so okay, so you're 20 years old and you are bored out of your mind. I have, by the way, very similar memories from my teens, a few years younger, because we didn't have secular subjects. So I was basically in the monastery experience from like I don't know, 14 on in a way, because yeshiva in Israel is like that. But so incredibly bored. So what happens next?
Well, different people have different paths, and my path was very, very slow, right? So afterwards, I went
Okay.
to college, and you go to college, and you're more exposed to the world. You're exposed to science, real science, right? College level science. You're exposed to
Can I
concepts.
ask? I actually don't. I wasn't clear on that. Some people do. They like do some, get some credits and stuff like that while they're in yeshiva, and they kind of get a degree concurrently. That's the model that I've often heard of. Evening classes maybe or something like that. You eventually paused and went to university full time.
No, I went to university, well, to college while in yeshiva, right? So it would be in the evening classes.
Evening classes.
Yeah.
Okay, so
So
fine.
evening
No, and
classes
that
over,
makes more sense.
right? And
Nonetheless, you got exposed to science. Yeah.
well, my parents wanted me to have a good, strong education. They wanted me to become a professional and encouraged me to study, and they're really focusing on my secular studies. So again, there's a lot of variables within the Orthodox community. So typically people who are Yeshivish modern, there's not, again, there's no doctrines that define it, but typically people in my kind of circle would go to college and they would take their secular education seriously, as opposed to, let's say, Haredis in Israel, who would not even entertain the possibility of getting an education, secular education. So, my home getting a secular education was really important.
Yes. Okay. So you get exposed to
You
science.
get exposed to science, and things just start unraveling. And again, while I was still in yeshiva before college, you would encounter these inconsistencies. For example, I remember reading Maimonides, which was one of the books that I tried finding meaning in. He has one of his books, I think is Sefer Hamada. I don't know what the translation would be. Maybe the Book of Science or the Book of
Of
Knowledge.
science or something. Yeah.
And he talks about different observations of the world. And one of those observations, he described the size of the moon. I don't remember what the ratio is, but he was clearly wrong, right? Nothing even close to reality. I think the moon is what, 2/3 or a third of the size of the Earth. He had something like 180 times smaller, something like that. Clearly wrong, and that was just one example of an inconsistency. And people would be telling me that the Rambam and all of these, these holy figures, these scholars, they had Ruach HaKodesh, they had the Word of God. They couldn't be wrong. They had to be right. So how do you explain that? How can we know what the size of the moon is? It's a pretty basic scientific observation. And if Maimonides, one of the greatest scholars, possibly the greatest scholar in Jewish history, is wrong about such a basic fact, you start trying to understand where do the incorrect assumptions start and where do they end? Right? If he's wrong about the size of the moon, what else is he wrong about? So, and then, I went to college, you start learning about, I studied biology, that was my major, and you study about evolution. And of course, within most Orthodox circles, evolution is unacceptable. It's false. The world is 6,000 or so years old. God created the world in 6 days. It's in the Bible. Evolution is the, the strongest, the worst kind of cursus, heresy. You can't believe in evolution. How, so this creates this kind of cognitive dissonance. On one hand, you're studying biology. Evolution is central to biology. And on the other hand, the Bible says that the world was created in 6 days. The rabbis say 6,000 years old. Evolution is false. And, eventually things start falling apart.
Mhm. Yeah. What did the falling apart look like for you?
Well, it was a process of many years for me, right? It was a
Yeah.
process of maybe 15 years,
Okay.
starting from maybe even longer, 20 years, starting from the doubts, questions, to I don't believe anymore. So it's a process of many years. I know there's some people who wake up one day and they're like, I'm not Orthodox anymore. I don't believe anymore. But for me, it was a really slow and grueling process, also a painful process.
Hmm.
Because as I've stated, I was very pious, very religious, very sincere. And to suddenly lose all of that, you become very confused.
Yes,
Um,
absolutely.
so, again, different people have different ways of manifesting their religious beliefs. But for me, religion was personal. I had a personal connection with God. I had a personal connection with Judaism. I would pray, fervently 3 times a day. And, you know, they teach you that God knows you very well. God reads your thoughts. God created you. Knows you better than you know yourself, knows you better than anyone knows you. God makes decisions for you. Um, um, God is everything in Judaism, right? Religion and Judaism is one of those religions that's all encompassing, kind of like Islam. It's not like you go to church on Sunday, and you don't do abortions. By
Right.
the way, just uh, I know I have Christian friends that I know. They have similar experiences to me, so it's not so it's not so different in that regard. Many religions are all encompassing for different communities, but certainly Judaism, which has so many requirements, it's pervasive in your life, and so to lose that one day, it can drive you mad.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. My main question, I'll put a pause on my main question, but my almost like more tangential question first is how far deep had you gotten sucked into religion at that point, religious lifestyle? Did you end up like married or kids or anything like that along this journey?
Right? No, I was not married yet, so I only started dating a little bit later on, and the dating system never really worked for me for some reason, and so no, I was not married.
Gotcha. So you didn't end up bound to the
Correct. Right.
system the way
Right.
a lot of
Right.
people in their
Right.
20s do. Okay, perfect. And I guess my main question for you was, what did you find particularly painful? I mean, you've alluded to it in broad strokes, but I was curious if you wanted to elaborate on some of the hardest things for you around leaving.
Yeah. For me, again, it was just having that. You grow up with this. First of all, you have God in your life, right? God is this figure, this fatherly, loving figure who's your friend and who listens to you and you pray to 3 times a day and you talk to and he reads your thoughts. And then one day you discover that he may not even exist. That could be a
Right.
shocking. Imagine someone dying in someone's life, right? That's traumatic. But
Right.
God is someone dying, but that's a different level because God is your friend. He knows you. He's your creator. And suddenly God dying could be really traumatic, really difficult. And again, the religious aspects of it also, not just the spiritual aspects, the religious aspects of it. You're doing these things every day since you're a toddler. You're praying, you're saying the brachas, the blessings over food. Religion is pervasive. When you're Orthodox, religion encompasses every aspect of your life, 24/7, 365.
Yeah.
There's no break. Every moment of your life, the way you're thinking, the way you're talking, the way you're walking. So imagine to lose that is really, really a large transition.
Yes. And what was that transition like for you? What helped you? What did you fill the space with, if you will?
Yeah, well, it was really difficult, right? I fell into deep depression as more I was exploring, and I would have these it would come and go in waves, right? I would ask questions, and I'll become depressed, so I'll stop asking questions. But of course, the questions just come at you because you're exposed to the world, and your mind is curious. You want to understand the world. You can't help but ask these questions. They keep on, you know, if you would be isolated, right? Let's say I was Hasidic and I was living in Williamsburg or Borough Park and I didn't go to college and I wasn't exposed to the world. I didn't have a TV. That would be one thing. Probably wouldn't be so difficult. But when you're exposed to the world, the questions just pop at you. They come at you like like waves in the ocean. you can't stop it. And so, again, this cognitive dissonance can be really difficult. And so I'd fall into this
Yeah.
really deep depression. Eventually, over many years, cognitively, subconsciously, you're able to manage it. And it just, but for me, again, for different people have different ways of coping. For me, it was just a really slow evolution. I just evolved into, feeling better about myself, not
Yeah.
taking religion so seriously. And eventually things just fall into place, but it was a really long and painful process.
Absolutely. I was curious about your level of exposure at that time, right? You're not going up Hasidic. Did you find yourself already working in like some Orthodox Jews stay working in Orthodox companies and that level of thing? Did you find yourself in the broader world more with non-Jewish friends or
Correct.
that
Yeah,
kind
I
of
went
thing?
to I went to graduate school. Well, as I was saying, my parents were very keen on me continuing my education, and so I went to graduate school. And this was not a religious school. College was religious, one of these religious institutions where you study at night, go to yeshiva during the day, and you study at night. But I mean, even then, that was a relief because in college it's going to be typically a more modern crowd, a more modern setting, and it's a secular education, and you get to go out more. And then graduate school, things start to transition more significantly. I would hang out with non-religious people, and so that was real. That was difficult. First going to a graduate school, a non-segregated school. That was my first time in my life, and I'm around age 24. It's the first time in my life where I'm actually interacting with females that are not my
Yeah.
siblings.
Right.
And so that was kind of a cultural shock. It was a really difficult transition. I was in school for 4 years, and then my last 2 years actually were great. I started going out, meeting people, and I had an amazing experience. But the first 2 years were really, really a difficult transition.
Yeah, that makes sense. So that exposure, whenever it does occur, is shocking.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So where do we find you now? It's been that transition has taken its time. Everyone has their own length of their journey. How would you describe yourself today?
Yeah, my transition, my story is interesting. I didn't leave the religion completely. I never left religion completely, even though I don't identify as religious. I'm still within the community to a certain extent. I got married a few years ago. I have two children, and so I'm still living one foot in, one foot out. So you know, people talk about being OTD. I don't consider myself OTD. I don't particularly like that label. I don't like labels in general. I consider myself to be culturally orthodox, or maybe orthoprax. I practice some things, and some things I don't practice. And again, there's no set definitions for that. It's just something that I adjusted and still adjusting, still figuring out. That's where I'm at right now.
Okay, very interesting. Now I've got lots of questions.
And I will tell you when
So yeah,
I
yeah.
didn't like I started going out on shidduch dates, the shidduch system, the matchmaking system. It wasn't appealing to me. And I started going to these singles events, and eventually I met someone who's now my wife. And when we were dating, made it very clear that I'm not religious. I don't plan on becoming more religious in the future. She said she was okay with it. I mean, it's not a perfect arrangement, but it works more or less. It's not, ideal, but it works more or less. Which brings me to the question of how am I going to raise my the children? And the interesting thing is,
Because to clarify, your wife is more observant
yeah,
than
my
you are,
wife,
if I'm
well,
understanding.
she generally is. I mean, there's different roles between a male and a female in religion, but generally she's more religious. She's more sincere about it. I do it out of as a cultural thing and out of habit.
Okay. Okay, quick, perfect. Yeah. So back to how you would raise your kids.
Yeah. So religion is not just a set of values. It's a cultural lifestyle as well. And so, how would I want my children to grow? And I think I would want them to be like me. And so I would want them to have this kind of religious upbringing, not the way that I had, but more kind of the cultural aspects. And so that's a challenge because you have to figure out where you're going to be sending your children to school. What kind of school? And school is a massive part of what kind of world outlook they're going to have. So
Yeah.
that's not something that I've quite figured out. It's something that I'm kind of experimenting with. But obviously, you want your child to have some similarities to you. Right? And so, since I'm
Mhm.
currently still in the community, still I currently identify culturally as Orthodox, I want him to have a similar kind of upbringing.
Yeah. That's fascinating. So I'm curious if I could elaborate on that. You know, a lot of people might the more common phenomenon I find is people either leave religion, but they're like, oh, I identify as culturally Jewish, so they do like Hanukkah and stuff like that. Or they say, well, practically I'm stuck here, so I'm going to do some of the movements. But for you, you actually find meaning in Orthodox practice. And I guess I'm curious for you, really on a personal level, most importantly, if it's been removed from God, if it's devoid of God, what do you find meaningful around? As you said, it's quite pervasive. Now, I'm sure there's things you just don't want to do, so you don't do them. Nonetheless, yeah, I don't know what the extent of your practice looks like, but what does it mean to you when there's no meaning behind it?
Yeah, it's always a challenge, right? For example, you go to synagogue, you go to temple, and that goes back again to this cognitive dissonance. That can be challenging. But for example, I would sing, would have a Friday night meal, and I would make kiddush, and I love kiddush. Kiddush is I got to tell you the story. Once I went to someone's house on a Friday night. This is maybe 8, 10 years ago, and me and my buddies, and right before Shabbos, we all smoked a joint, and we went to kiddush. As Shabbos is coming in, Shabbos came in, and I was still high, and someone in that household made a kiddush, and being high, that kiddush was the most amazing kiddush I've heard in my life. It was I I was high. This guy wasn't high. He was just making kiddush, and he was Hasidish fellow, and he was making kiddush.
Mhm.
It was a beautiful kiddush. He had such sincerity, and I felt a spiritual connection there. So there's a lot of, I think, beautiful aspects to religion, and
Right.
try to take the
Yeah.
good and leave out the aspects that are less valuable to you. Um,
Yeah. And just for the listeners, Kiddush is the blessing on the wine on Friday night. It's a very specific scene, right, that you're describing, right? As the house is all clean and we're about to have a really
yeah,
nice
the
meal and
candles
everyone's
the
all
candles
together.
are on.
Yeah.
Everyone is wearing
Yeah.
their Shabbos clothing.
Yeah.
It's a very serene and uplifting experience. And
Okay.
I try
Yeah.
to emulate that every Friday night. I make that kiddush, and I don't smoke that joint, of course, but I try to emulate that and to make that experience. Havdalah, for example, is another beautiful. I love Havdalah. It's really it's cathartic almost. You light the candle, and it's a few minutes in which you're reflecting over the past week. It
Mhm.
can be beautiful, and so that's just another example.
Yeah. Yeah. So Havdalah being the opposite, the transition from the Sabbath into the week, and you've made that into a personal growth ritual and a way of just contemplating where things were and where you're
Exactly,
headed kind of thing.
exactly, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess following up on that, like one level deeper, I find a lot of times people are gravitate towards the practices, the rituals, because they mean something to them. But then there's a whole other slew of actually even more laws of what not to do, and I'm curious what those mean to you.
Yeah,
Prohibition.
um, a lot of it. I mean, as I said, I'm still 1 foot in the community, 1 foot out. I wouldn't say it's necessarily by choice. I wouldn't say my situation is ideal, but considering all the circumstances, my family that's religious, and my wife that's religious, and the fact that I'm still physically kind of living in the community, so there are certain things that I just do naturally. And one of those things are, I'll say, kashrus. Out of habit,
Keeping
I
kosher.
don't eat non-kosher, right? I
Right.
still do eat kind of vegetarian non-kosher, but I don't typically eat non-kosher meat, etc. Even though something that I would like to do, I think about doing, but I haven't done that yet. I'm not sure if that's more of a constraint or more of a habit, but that's just one example. There's it's really just a lot of it's cultural. I try to be a little bit more open in the world, and kind of, as religious people, we tend to restrict ourselves. I try not to restrict myself so much. It's not necessarily any things that are considered sinful necessarily, but just try to just push the envelope a little bit, try to explore a little bit, just live life.
Yeah. Yeah. So following up on that, I guess I'm curious still about your desire for anonymity. Where does that fit in? I mean, obviously there's broad context based on everything you've shared, and I'm curious still though around that maybe that dilemma of being yourself versus being in community. If you wanted to talk about
Yeah,
that
it's
more.
it's 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 complicated. I mean, unfortunately, there's in a religious community, not being religious is stigmatized. It's not acceptable.
Right.
And so kind of try to juggle these roles. And, part of my family knows that I don't believe in God. Part of my family does not know that. I wouldn't dare bring it up. Actually, I tried doing that once to my mom and I kind of regretted her. I told her once, I don't believe none of it is true. And I remember she opened up a Bible and she was flipping through it, trying to prove me wrong. And I felt so bad. I just felt really emotional about it. And I said, I'm never going to do that again. My parents are different generation, different era. They're boomers in English. They grew up in the
Mhm.
60s. And so I wouldn't want to burden them with that knowledge. And so, I think they know to an extent that I'm not as religious as I used to be when I was a kid. And that was also painful for them to see that. And it's difficult. Unfortunately, we are stigmatized and there's no real venue in within the community. There's no pathway within the community to become less religious. Kind of like, the Amish, for example, where you have a choice. There's no choice in Judaism. In Judaism, you have to be religious. Everyone has to be religious all the time. There's no going back. There's no, you know, changing your mind about that.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And how you describe it, I think, is very touching, actually. And I'm curious, does that mean that you're the only one of your siblings who has at least to some degree left?
No, I have another sibling who's similar mindset to me, and that's really comforting. We talk a lot about it.
Okay.
Share the same kind of similar struggles with regard to kind of juggling these roles within the community.
Are they fairly close to you in birth order? Like they're kind of
Yeah,
towards the
he's
end?
younger than me. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And I'm curious, I guess, so then broadly, right? What was you've such an interesting and unique arrangement within, yourself and religion and the community. What was it that you wanted to share in particular on the podcast? What's the message you would like to impart to listeners?
Yeah, I think to people who are listening who are kind of sharing similar struggles, I think the most important thing is to not be alone in this. Being alone for me was one of the hardest things. And eventually you would meet people with similar ideas within the community. I'm not talking about outside of the community, I'm talking about within the community. People who have questions, people who are not satisfied, people who stop believing. And I remember once I was in synagogue on the Shabbos and we were reading, the Torah was being read. And one of my friends blurted out something as to, "Oh yeah, we're sacrificing to." He was making some statement about the sacrifices, which made it to be clear that he doesn't believe. And I was shocked. I was shocked, and at that moment, I felt like a stone had been rolled off my chest. We started talking a lot about religion and sharing our experiences. So it's really important to understand, first of all, that you're not alone. For every person who has these questions, there's many others that you may know in person or may not know but who have similar struggles. And so it's important to try to reach out and find these people. Obviously, you're not going to want to go to your parents necessarily, but anyone with whom you feel comfortable or feel like they might have some form of challenge in that regard. So it's really important to establish that kind of network of people that with whom you can talk to about these things, because being alone is probably one of the most difficult aspects of kind of stepping out of the community.
Yeah, that's really well said. I'm curious, you've mentioned a bunch of things. You mentioned Reddit, you've mentioned that friend that you found, you've mentioned just going to university. Were those the main aspects of where you finally found belonging?
Well, I don't really have a community right now. Right, I have my friends, but you know, I live in Brooklyn right now, and it's not really ideal to be in to be one foot in, one foot out. There's no kind of community where you can go to synagogue and, enjoy some of the cultural aspects of it and kind of be 1 foot in, 1 foot out. So it's still a challenge trying to find an actual physical place where I feel like I can fit in. But certainly I do have friends. I do like to go on Reddit a lot to kind of get a little outlet over there. And the other thing is that, I really started in my 20s, I started exploring life. A lot, the world is a big place. There's a lot of things to explore, a lot of things to do. Life is short. So go out there and explore the world, whether it means traveling, whether just exploring locally different things, different hobbies. There's a lot to see out there. So go out there and live life.
Amazing. What are some of the things that you've done if you feel comfortable sharing?
I've traveled around the world. I've traveled to South America, Central America. Those are really enjoyable experiences, usually on my own. What else? I live in New York. New York is an incredible city. I have
Yeah,
a love-hate relationship with New York, but if you're single and you're young and you haven't explored New York City completely, there's a ton of stuff to do. Just go out there, you can just take a walk in Manhattan and end up in, different museums. It's just an incredible city. And the USA is an incredible place. The world's an incredible place. So I just like to be curious. I like to explore the other things that kind of help me.
amazing. Thank you, Jayson. Is there anything else you would want to share?
Yeah, I want to shout out my rabbi, Harav and Richard Dawkins Shlita. And to me, I say it kind of jokingly, but for me, he has been my rabbi. I haven't had a personal relationship with him, but I've watched many of his videos, and he's the reason why I call him my rabbi is because he has this kind of sincerity. He has this kind of fatherly figure to him, and he has this sincerity, and he has this way of explaining things in a simple and beautiful manner. So, I haven't really read his books, but he has an incredible lectures online on YouTube. Just Google Richard Dawkins lectures. They're really well thought out and well spoken, and he's just a phenomenal persona.
Exactly. And it really speaks to that point of like when you're going through, I've had this, my journey out was not particularly intellectual. That is not to say that I wasn't intellectual. Ironically, I think when I look back, the intellect was gone first. Like none of it really made sense from a young age, but I had suspended it because of the emotional glue that held it all together. But because of that, when I would encounter things that finally laid to rest these deep questions that I had, there was this deep relief. I don't know if you resonate with that. This like I can finally breathe again when somebody finally explains to me either some phenomenon in the world, like how evolution actually works or something like that, or how this thing in Judaism came to be. Like, how is it that we wear black hats if Moses didn't wear black hats? And nobody bothered to explain that because everyone pretends that, we've been looking the same for eternity. When I understood the concept of rabbinic Judaism, this is an example of like how it emerged and what the cultural forces were, there was a real relief of the cognitive dissonance finally making sense with these two forces. And so I resonate with parts of, I don't know if that's exactly your
Yeah,
experience, but that to me, yeah,
it's funny you mentioned it. I had this book that I bought many years ago in Israel. It's a Hebrew book, and it's a book that explains terms, Judaic terms. So, for example, it's kind of like a history book. It's kind of like an encyclopedia, so to speak, or some of our kind of index has, a term, a word, a name. Let's say a name of a Tanakh book, a book in the Bible, and it'll describe when it was written, who wrote it, etc. And it would completely dismantle all religious aspects of it. Just describe it in a dry manner of scientifically what we know about it. And to me, the first time I read those books, it was real difficult to read it. But now when I open that book, and it's very funny because it's sitting in my parents' Sfarim shank, this Sfarim closet with with all the other holy books, but it's a completely atheistic book, and it's great. I open it, and it's and by the way, I love the history of especially going back to the time of the Bible. It's a fascinating history, and so I just open it up to a random page and read something about the Copper Scroll, for example. Probably not familiar with it, but there's a scroll written about 2,500 years ago in Hebrew in Israel. It's right now held in Jordan, and it essentially has this, it's kind of like a treasure map, a description to some sort of treasure. It's not a religious text, but there's these different kinds of texts, talk about Megillas Rus, or all the different Megillos scrolls in scripture, etc., and describe their origin, who wrote it, when it was written, etc. So yeah, I definitely resonate with that.
Yeah. Is this by the way, the legendary Concordancia?
I don't think so. I don't remember the name of it. It's just some small
Okay.
book written many years ago. I'm not.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah. We used to have this book, but it was quite religious still. I thought the name was hilarious,
Yeah.
but it was basically it's like a glossary of
Right.
words you had
Exactly.
to
Yeah.
look up and
Glossary.
find the
Exactly.
translation
Exactly.
of, but it wasn't so helpful, and I don't know if it had that objective stance
Right.
that's so important
Yeah.
to you.
Yeah.
Just the other day, I could share this with you. It's so random. I was driving to like carpool, and it just occurred to me that the Hebrew dates of the Hebrew year. I studied the Bible extensively. That was the school that I was sent to, and I would this dissonance again that just pops into your head that I remember probably being bothered on some level already then. The Hebrew months are all no one really explained like the Babylonian influences
Right.
on Judaism. It doesn't really make much
Right.
sense. Why it's a Babylonian, completely Mesopotamian culture, not Jewish, and yet our letters are apparently described that. But more importantly, the month Tammuz, the middle of the summer, the month of Tammuz, is named after a Babylonian idol,
Right. Yes.
right? A god.
Yes.
And it's so tight because normally it'd be like, no, they would say like, who says it's named after a god? But it's actually in the Bible. Jeremiah, I think, is the one, or Ezekiel refers to the god of Tammuz.
Right.
So
Interesting.
now we've got this month that everyone refers to, and it's named after an idol. And like that's not a very Jewish thing to do.
Yeah.
And that's just like jumped into my head the other day. And again, I hopped onto ChatGPT. We had a chat. I worked through some of the things, but I had to fill in blanks that the Orthodox Jews couldn't. And
Yeah.
there's a lot of dissonance that can come from those kinds of little things that gnaw at you constantly.
Yeah. For sure. For sure. Yeah. Absolutely. Another example is the modern Hebrew, at least the Hebrew in which the Aleph Beis. That's a relatively new form in Judaism. The original Hebrew letter uh, evolved as Canaanite, and it's completely different.
Exactly.
The current Hebrew form is Ksav Ashuri, Assyrian.
Yeah. Assyrian font.
Right. So
Yeah.
I don't even know. I never got a complete answer about what that actually meant. But apparently, the Torah is written in not original Hebrew, which was quite shocking the first time I found that out.
100%. I mean, I remember grappling with that for years. No one could explain it to me. There was, because you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls and stuff like that, and you see the font that they're written in, and now that's clearly the font that was spoken at the time.
Right.
And now you're looking at the Torah, which is supposedly a straight lineage, and every scribe copies it over from the
Yes.
book before,
Yeah.
and it's a completely different font.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then there's even weird things like the Talmud talks at some point about how the letter M, which is like the equivalent basically of O, Mem Sofit is like an O in English, meaning it's completely a circle on all sides. Like if you had a stencil, you'd have to have little bits holding the middle up.
Right.
And there's this talk about the Ten Commandments were like pierced straight through, and how did that work
Yeah.
as a whole thing. But that's all assuming the font was the modern font.
Yeah.
And the rabbis do have some apologetic experience about how the Syrians had some merit, so they merited to
Oh,
have their
that what they
font be
say?
used.
Interesting.
There's something about that Ktavashuri that there's some, but again, it's all reversed and it doesn't really fit with. I don't know how it got inserted, but it's the kind of thing that you have more. Your questions are better than the answers given,
Sure.
and it's actually really painful. I resonate with part of what you were describing when you're just trying to get the true answer, whatever it is, and you're just being gaslit all the
Yeah.
time by like apologetic answers, and it's like you don't know how to dig one level deeper or to call bullshit, but it just doesn't satisfy
Yeah. Sure.
whatever you're asking.
I
Yeah.
remember when in my exploratory phase, I was reading about archaeology, and in the 1800s, there was a lot of archaeology done in Israel, and two of these famous archaeologists. One of them his name was Bright. His last name was Bright, and the other one, his last name was Albright. Two different people with similar names, and they were both atheists, or I don't know if atheists, but they did not believe in the Torah being divine. And anyway, once I was in a shul and I saw this pamphlet from Aish, and this pamphlet from Aish had a paragraph over there written by these two archaeologists. And the paragraph was basically a quote from them, and the quote was essentially saying something to akin to, the Bible describes things as they were. Because there's when it comes to biblical archaeology, it can be categorized into two schools of thought. It's called minimalist or maximalist. The minimalists believe that there's not much in the Tanakh and the Torah and the Bible that's actually historically accurate. The descriptions of events, the names of kings. For example, they believe that King David was a fictional character. The
Okay.
maximalists, on the other hand, believe that no, the Torah is accurate historically. So King David did exist. He did have a kingdom. And many of the events that were described in the Tanakh actually did occur as described. However, there's a difference between being a maximalist and being a believer in the divinity of it, right? So you could be a maximalist
Right.
and actually believe that King David existed and they had a kingdom that spanned from area X to area Z to area Y as described in the Bible. That doesn't necessarily mean they believe that King David spoke to God and he was a divine entity, right? So these two characters, Bright and Albright, they were maximalists. They believed, based on their archaeological digs, that the Bible does describe historical events. However, they were clearly non-believers. However, this did not stop Age from quoting them and saying, you see, even these two gentlemen agree that the Torah is correct. So there's
Yeah.
a lot of
Yeah.
selective quoting and as you said, a lot of apologetics there. But unfortunately, it's just, if you dig deeper, you will find that's just not satisfactory. It doesn't do the job.
Oh, at all. I've spent my career mocking Aish specifically. And with that, I was actually going to ask you if you had anything you wanted to ask me. I usually like to equalize the playing field if you want.
What was your experiencing like, and how did it start actually?
Experience with what?
What was your experience kind of like? What was your first like questions that you've had?
Oh, a question. Interesting. If you're going to phrase it as questions. Well, first of all, I'll say that I have an entire episode on the show where I had my partner interview me. So
Oh,
you can
okay,
definitely dive
sure.
in more detail there. But interesting enough, if you phrase it as questions, when I left religion, I did not leave because of questions. I left because I was angry. But one of my first questions I ever had, and it fits so well with what you're describing here, was I talk about it a bunch, but I was in first grade probably. And they sat me in front of the Bible and they said, start reading. And my Hebrew wasn't even that great. I'd only learned Hebrew fairly late compared to everybody else around me. And it was just rote reading all day long.
Right.
And I remember being struck by the book of Genesis, how different the language in that specific first parsha, the Genesis, even before you get to the book of Noah, which already like stabilizes. But in the book of Genesis, the poetic style of writing is so different than even the rest of the Bible. And I was 6 years old
Wow.
and I picked up on that.
Wow.
I picked up on these non sequitur sentences that are very apparent
Interesting.
in that first book, and in just the general more flowery, it's actually a really beautiful. It's much more poetic and descriptive. Apparently, it's more ancient, interestingly enough,
The first
which is
chapters, you mean?
surprising. The first
Yeah.
chapters are the oldest of the Bible. And even that, they have multiple authors. And I
Right.
was picking up on the multiple authors and the piecemeal way in which because those first chapters were so pivotal, everybody kept trying to like warp it to their story.
Right. Right.
And so people would come in and like insert like a verse here, a paragraph there,
Right.
and it ended up being the most piecemeal probably of the entire Bible. But I picked up on that at 6.
Well,
And it was a question that I had no way to phrase, but I distinctly remember the almost magical. I describe it. You know the book's Narnia? The
yes.
Narnia. It had a Narnia level of magic. It's ironic because Narnia is itself a biblical allegory. So I think I only read Narnia later on, but I create that simile between the Narnia world of magic, because he has that first book, The Magician's Nephew, that literally he has the creation story.
Right.
And I always, it felt the same. Like if you wrote the creation story in Hebrew, it would sound like Narnia. And
Interesting.
that was my journey. And
Wow.
that's like a very specific question that comes to my
It's
mind.
pretty amazing that it happened at such a young age. Interesting. Wow. Incredible.
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing, Jason. Thank you so much for joining today. You've got a very cool story and a very cool way of navigating through the world, and we appreciate you sharing it with us.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Beyond Belief. If you found the episode inspiring, please share it with others who might benefit from it. and be sure to subscribe to it to get updates about future episodes.